In this video, we are going to finally talk about how we can apply security using OAuth2. So here, as you have seen, we have implemented all these microservices, and then we have implemented API gateway and also implemented this bookstore web application. But so far we have not implemented any security. So this is where we are going to actually set up OAuth based security and then implement security for some of these services. So why some of these services? So here notification service is not going to be called directly from anywhere else. Only it is going to consume the messages from rabbitmq and then process it. So we are not going to secure notification service. And catalog service is not providing any sensitive information or anything like that. It is only giving the API to return the catalog of products and all. So I don't see any benefit of applying security here. But if there are other services which needs to be protected, maybe we can apply the security as well. So here, the only two things that we need to protect here is order service. Only authenticated users should be able to place an order and try to see their all the orders they placed, or they want to see their own order details. So almost every API in the order service should be protected. Every API in the sense anything related to orders. And similarly, from the bookstore web application point of view, again, we should be able to see the products without even logging into the application. We should be able to see products page and then navigate across multiple pages and all. We can do that. But if the user is trying to, we can even allow the users to add the products to their cart. And when they click on cart link to see their cart, or if they want to see the list of orders they placed, so then we would like to redirect the user to login page, and then only after logging in successfully, they should be able to either place the order or see their orders list or view a particular order details. So basically we are going to secure bookstore web application and order service. So these are the two things we are going to secure in our application. Before getting into the OAuth security implementation, first let us understand how different types of applications are usually secured. So let's talk about the first type of application. Traditionally, you have built a web application using things like SpringMvc and TimeLeaf, which is server rendered web application. So for securing that type of application, maybe you can simply implement all this authentication logic, like you have some users table in your database, and then when the user tries to log in, you compare the credentials with the stored information, and then you authenticate them. So it is a very simple and straightforward approach here. And once the user logged in, there are again different ways how you can store that this particular user is already authenticated. So traditionally, you can put the authentication status in the HTTP session itself, or you may, the problem with putting this authenticated status in HTTP session, when you want to scale your application horizontally, like if you want to run multiple instances of this application, then you may have a load balancer and each request might go to a different server. So in that case, you may again go for HTTP session replication or some other techniques like always routing the same client to the same server node. So again, that there are some complications like that. Another approach, some time ago, I see in some of the projects, how they implemented is like once the user is authenticated, and if the user is trying to put anything related to that user specific session, they store all that information in the database itself. And only the JSession ID or some GUID is created to associate with that session, and that is sent back to the client. So for every request, that is also going to be sent like a cookie or a header, and then it is going to identify that session information from the database itself. And it is a widely common practice, and there is a project called Spring Session. Okay. So here Spring Session is kind of trying to do the similar thing where you can configure your where you want to store your HTTP session data. Like you can use Redis, you can use even SQL databases. So once you authenticate, HTTP this Spring Session helps you to automatically whatever the data that you are trying to put in the session, that is going to be stored in the database itself. So the advantage is, even if you scale up your system horizontally, whenever somebody tries to look up a session data, that is going to check in the database itself, no matter which node the request is processing your request. So that is going to work just fine. You don't need to have this session replication or sticky session. So we don't need to handle all that things. So that is how you can implement security at the server-rendered application level. It's a simple web application. And in the recent times, the trend is more like you have a separate single page application at the front end, and then your application backend is providing REST APIs, and your single page application is talking to this REST API, and this is how many applications built in the recent times. So here, how do we do that? Again, your server is going to handle most of the authentication things, like when the user tries to first log in, obviously you will show a login form or something in the single page application, and user provide their credentials and send a request to the server, and that compares the data with the existing user's information, and if it is successful, it will create a JWT token and send back it as a response. And on the client side, we usually store that either in a cookie or in a local storage somewhere. And from then onwards, for every request, API request you are making, you are going to include that as a authorization header or something like that. And each time it is going to take that authorization header and then extract the JWT token value, and then try to parse it and then verify whether this is a valid token or not. And then if it is successful, it will proceed to process the request. So this is if you are building a single page application having a backend REST API, this approach is sufficient. I mean, you don't need to go for OAuth. This itself is sufficient, but there is nothing preventing you. Even in this scenario, you can go ahead and implement OAuth based security, but this is sufficient. Like in Spring based application, you can use Spring Security to create this JWT token, and then you can implement all this as I just described. But when it comes to microservices, things got a little bit more complex. Like you have a bunch of microservices, and you have an API gateway, and you might have more than one type of client. You might have some administration website built using a Spring MVC web application, and you might have client application, public facing client application, which you talk to these microservices through API gateway. So in this case, there is no one place which you can put your authentication logic, because there are so many microservices. So in this case, how typically authentication is handled is security. So we are going to use OAuth2. In OAuth2, there are multiple roles, like there is an authorization server, there is a client, and there is a resource server. So typically these are all considered as resource servers, our microservices, where the user's data actually resides. So these are all the resource servers. And this is a OAuth authorization server, which handles the authentication and validating the tokens and all is handled by this authorization server. And these are the client applications. So again, there are multiple types of client applications. This is like a Spring MVC server rendered application, where you can configure some secured keys and all in a secure way. So this is called a confidential client. But if you are building a single page application where everything, your HTML, your JavaScript, your styling, everything is available on the client side, and you cannot securely store your anything, keys or passwords or anything like that. So this is called a public client. So how do you secure your client applications is different based on the type of client. Okay, so typically the process is, when any of these client tries to log in, it is going to redirect to the login page provided by auth server, and once the authentication is successful, it is going to return two kinds of tokens, access token and ID token. Usually access token contains the token that represents you are authenticated, and ID token contains the authenticated user's information, maybe what kind of a role they have, and their authorizations, and even the personal information, maybe email or any other details that you want to share. So ID token contains the authenticated user related information. Access token contains the token that is used for your authentication purposes. Okay, so once you send those details, access token and ID token, in some way they store in their client side in the sense, if it is web application Spring MVC based, as I mentioned, you can store it in HTTP session or in database somewhere. If it is a React or Angular type application, public client application, maybe you can store those tokens as cookies, secure cookies or something like that. So once you have this access token and ID token, from then onwards, whenever you make a backend API call, you also send that access token for each request as authorization header. And this OAuth security can be implemented in a very different ways. Like you can centralize all these authentication checks at the API gateway level. That is one approach. Or you can simply delegate that to microservices itself. So it can be handled at different ways. And here let's assume you are handling at API gateway. So in this way, what happens, whenever you send a request, it is going to validate that authorization header token value by checking with auth server. But it can be like, you may think, so for every API call, it is going to make another call to authorization server and then first validate the token. That may be a performance hit, right? But it can be in a slightly different way. Instead of every time trying to call auth server for validating the token, they can get these public keys from the auth server, and then whenever you send a auth token, using those keys they can check and then see whether the token is valid or not, so that it doesn't have to make this REST API call to auth server for every API call. So it can be more performant. So that way you can validate this request and then forward the request to this downstream microservices. Or maybe you can simply forward the request to microservices, and the same thing can be happen here between microservice and auth server. Whenever it wants to check whether the given token is valid or not, it can download once the keys and then cache them, and then use those keys to decrypt this token and then validate this. So that can be done at the microservice level also. So in our case, we are not going to implement this auth checks at the API gateway level. Instead, our microservices is going to validate that. Okay, and again, this is all in theory, but when you are using frameworks, many of these things automatically happens based on some configuration. You don't implement all these features like downloading the public keys and all. You don't explicitly implement that. The framework like Spring Security provides automatically. We just need to configure them in the proper way. That's all we need to do. Okay, so having talked about different ways, obviously we are going with this approach, and let us see how we can implement our API security into our bookstore application. Okay, security is itself a complex topic. On top of it, OAuth based security is even more complex topic. And this OAuth based security, it itself can be a completely different series in itself. So I'm not going to go in depth of how everything works together. Instead, I would recommend you to take a look at my blog post series. Like if you go to SivaLabs.in and if you click on this tutorials and Spring Boot tutorials, here there is a 10-part series on Spring Security OAuth 2. So here I have described how you can get started with OAuth security, first understanding different types of flows, and then finally we have implemented a sample application also by applying various things that we learned. So here there are multiple resource servers, there is an authorization server, there is a web client, and then we implement different flows. How do you authenticate, and then how do you make a call to one of the resource server, from one resource server to another resource server, how do you make a call. So in this series I have covered so many common use cases and how do you apply OAuth to base security. And I have used Spring Security OAuth support in Spring Security 6. So it is a relatively recent version we have used. And also I have used Keycloak as the OAuth2 server. So I highly recommend you to, if you are new and you want to properly understand how OAuth 2 works, I strongly recommend you to first go through this series, because in our application it is relatively much simpler than what I covered in this series. Especially in this sample application, I have covered more use cases than what we have to implement in our application. So I highly recommend you to go through this series, and in each article I have explained with plenty of code examples how do you achieve certain things in a progressive manner. So you will find it very useful to not only just implement by simply configuring here and there. You will understand why we are doing certain thing, and progressively first do this step and then you achieve this, and then how do you achieve something else. So like that it is implemented in a very progressive manner. So I highly recommend you to go through this article series, and then if you continue with this video, you will be able to easily follow along. Otherwise it's gonna kind of a bit looks complex. But again, as I said, OAuth 2 base security it itself is a little bit complex topic, and covering all that into this series is not the intention. So as there is a decent material here itself, I highly recommend you to go through it. But we are going to implement all the necessary things for securing our web application, and I am going to explain each step how we are doing that. But again, I am highly recommend you to go through this series. OAuth 2 is a standard security protocol, and there are many implementation of OAuth servers. Like Keycloak is a complete open source identity and access management solution which implements OAuth 2 protocol, and also there are other alternatives like Okta, Auth0. So there are many others. Similarly, you can also use same OAuth 2 and you can implement login with social accounts, like sign in with Google, sign in with GitHub or Facebook. You can also follow in the same way, and you can leverage these public OAuth 2 providers also. So in our application we are going to use Keycloak, and though in theory you can switch from one provider to a different provider, like you can use Keycloak, and then if you want to switch to Okta, it should be doable. But again, as we are sticking with the OAuth 2 protocol, it shouldn't be like a big bang rewrite, but there will be minimal changes. How do you process some roles or things like that? But it is sticking with the protocols and standards. You will be able to switch to a different provider. Maybe during the development you want to use Keycloak, or for production you may want to go for Okta or Auth0, things like that. So I see in some of the companies this is a common pattern where they want to use Keycloak. And I mean, I am not saying Keycloak is not a production ready product. It is definitely being used in production in many companies, but for whatever reason this is very easy to use Keycloak for during development and testing and everything. And if you want to switch, you can switch. Okay, so in our application we are going to use Keycloak not only for testing, we are going to use this for our deployment purpose as well. So let's get started with Keycloak. So here in our infra.yaml, I have configured the Keycloak. Here by the time I record this video, Keycloak newest version is 24.02, and we are starting the server in a dev mode, and we are customizing the port 9191. By default it's going to be 8080. I'm changing it to run on 9191, and also I'm exposing the same port on the host as well. And here we are configuring the default admin credentials as admin and admin1234. Okay, so now I have started this infrastructure. Here I ran task restart and all these containers are started. So here if I go to and see, Keycloak is already started and it is running on port 9191. So let me go ahead and open this admin console, localhost 9191. I am logging in with admin and admin1234, and once I logged in, here you need to create, instead of creating whatever the services or clients, you should create your own realm first and then configure everything in that realm. So we are going to create a new realm called bookstore. So here, and I am enabling it and created this bookstore realm, and it is already selected here. So everything, what are the clients or users that we are going to create, everything will go into this bookstore realm. So now we are going to create our first client. I mean only the bookstore we are going to register. But here if you go to create client, and you need to more or less, most of the applications these days use OpenID Connect instead of SAML, and I am giving client ID as bookstore web application, bookstore-web app, and I am giving the name as bookstore. Next, and here let us I am assuming that you have gone through these tutorials, because most of the terminology that I am going to talk about here is based on the things that I already explained in this series. So please go through that series to get a good understanding of this. So here, client authentication. So what does this actually means? This defines the type of OIDC client. When it is on, the OIDC type is set to confidential access type. When it is off, it is set to public access type. So if we are building a single page application client, then we should leave it as off. But ours is a Spring MVC based server rendered application where you can configure the secrets. We should enable this one. So our bookstore web app is a confidential access type. And authorization is whether you want to enable our fine-grained authorization support, we can, but we don't need that. And authentication flow, this is the authorization code flow that we are going to use, so we need to enable this. And direct access grants is nothing but a resource owner password credentials grant. We are not going to use this, and this is actually kind of a deprecated, not recommended to anymore. And next, and here we need to configure these URLs, and our application is running, our bookstore web application is running on localhost 8080. So it is going to be localhost 8080. Home URL is also same, and valid redirect URL. So this is one thing maybe specific to your application framework that you are using. We are using Spring Security OAuth2, and the default redirect URL is this one, your base URL /login/OAuth2/code/ and the client ID. Okay, this is the client ID. So this is what we are configuring as the redirect URL. And valid post logout redirect URL. So when you are logging out, to which URL you want to redirect the user to. So this is what we want to redirect to. And web origins, this is again for CORS, and we are setting, this is where the request will come from. And make sure not even include an extra slash or something like that. Just having one extra slash or not having it also causes a lot of trouble. Okay, it is going to complain that it is invalid redirect URL and all those kind of things. So make sure you provide these values exactly the way I am explaining it here. Okay, and now save it. So now it is created, but if you go to credentials tab, you can see this is the client secret, and we can copy this somewhere, and we can configure the client ID and client secret, and then we should be able to log in using this Keycloak in our application once we configure. And before that, let us also go ahead and create a couple of users. I am creating a new user here, and I am enabling this email verified. If not, it is going to try to send email and you need to verify that. So I am just enabling this, and username is Siva and email is siva@gmail.com. I am simply giving some dummy values here, and Siva. So I'm creating first user, but you need to go into these credentials and specifically set the password. I'm going to give Siva1234. Okay, and okay, and by default it is temporary on. If you leave it, once you log in with these credentials, you should be you need to change the credentials, but I don't want to do that, so I'm turning off this temporary and saving it. Okay, now we have our first user. Let me go ahead and create another user. So with the name Prasad, prasad@gmail.com. First name Prasad, last name same. Okay, and create. Again, go into credentials and set a password as Prasad1234. Turning off the temporary flag and set. So now I have a client bookstore web app client configured, and I have a couple of users created. So why it is okay, it is not verified. It says let me change it. So it is verified now. So now we have this configuration. But the problem is, let's say we configured our Keycloak server with the default settings, and then once we log in, we set up this client and users and everything manually. What happens if by mistake I delete KeycloakContainer? When I restart, I need to again go ahead and configure everything one more time. So instead, there is a mechanism where you can export this realm configuration and include this realm configuration file while bootstrapping your KeycloakContainer itself, so that even if you delete this, and then you should be able to simply restart with that realm export configuration file, and this will be automatically configured. Okay, so here in this blog post, in the part 6 microservices sample project setup, I have these steps how you can export your current realm configuration into a JSON file. So how we can do this? First, I am going to run this docker ps to check the KeycloakContainer ID. So I am going to go here, and here I am running docker ps. So here this is the KeycloakContainer ID, and next I need to run docker exec it and run the bash shell within this container. So I am going to do that, docker exec it. So this is the container. Now I am inside the container now. Okay, now what I need to execute, there is a script called kc.sh inside the KeycloakContainer, and I am exporting this into this directory, and I am specifying what is the realm I want to export. So in this article I mentioned SivaLabs, but ours is bookstore, and here I am saying include the user's configuration also and create the realm file. So I'm going to copy this and go into here, and here I need to change, instead of SivaLabs it should be bookstore, the realm name. Okay, so now when I run that, it is going to export the configuration, like we have our bookstore web app client, and then we have created a couple of users. So all that configuration is already there in this exported file. So now we need to exit from the container, and from the host machine we need to run this one. So here I am going to run, this is not SivaLabs realm, this is going to be bookstore realm. And also when we created inside the container, it is bookstore realm JSON, and also here I need to specify the container ID. So here I need to give this ID. Now when I run that, docker cp command not found. No, I am still inside this container. So first I am going to exit this, and then I am going to run this command here. No, let me copy this command. So I ran that while I was inside the container itself. So now I am on the host. So it is successfully copied this into bookstore realm JSON file. Okay, now I am going to copy that file and put it in our repository. So here I have copied that bookstore realm JSON file that we exported and put it in the inside the Docker Compose. I have created realm config, and inside that I have this JSON file. And in the Keycloak configuration, I have also enabled this flag as realm import, which is going to automatically import all the JSON files that are there inside this directory. And we are mapping our realm config folder to be this directory inside the container. So when we start the Keycloak container, it is going to run all the import all the realm configurations from this location. Okay, so now let us go ahead and delete all these containers. So I am going to delete all of them, and now I am going to restart the infrastructure now. Okay, now with this, next time when I log in into our Keycloak administration website, it should already contain the bookstore realm, and also be there a bookstore web app client, and then our users as well. Okay, let's go ahead and see whether these services are up or not. So most of the services are running. Now I go ahead and open localhost 9191. And here I am going to log in with admin1234, and here I can see bookstore realm already, and if I go to clients I can see bookstore web app. Okay, and if I go to users, yes, there are 2 users. So with this configuration, even if you delete or even for testing purpose, you have the infrastructure in place to automatically spin up with all the pre-configured setup. Okay, so next we are going to configure our bookstore web application and talk to this Keycloak service as a authentication provider and implement authentication. Okay, I have already made the changes to secure our bookstore web application. I will walk you through what are all the changes that I have done. So first, let us start with the pom.xml dependency updates. So we are adding this TimeLeaf Spring Security extras. So we can use some TimeLeaf security tag leaves to secure some parts of the information only to display when the user is authenticated, things like that. So we have this, and we have added Springboot Starter security, and also we have added Springboot Starter OAuth2 client. So our bookstore web application is a client. So we have added this starter, and also I have added this Spring Security test. So this is for providing some testing capabilities to automate. Okay, so these are the dependencies we just need to add for securing our web application based on our Spring Boot MVC based application. If it is a single page application, you have to follow obviously a different approach, but this is how we can secure our web application. Once I have added this, I need to configure our application, what is the OAuth server and what is the realm and everything. Okay, so here, in order to avoid repeating some common things, I have created a couple of variables here. OAuth2 server URL. So our Keycloak server is running on port 9191. So first I created this variable, and then we are going to reference our realm URL in some places. So again, I created a variable where it is going to be this base URL /realms/bookstore. So our realm name is bookstore. So that is the variable we have configured here. Next, here we are registering the client and we are giving a name. This is the made up name. It can be anything. It can be simple bookstore or it can be bookstore web application. So it can be anything. But the client ID is what we have given while creating this client. Here we created bookstore web app, right? So this is the client ID. Okay, this is the client ID. So we need to give same here. And so for all this specific client, we are giving the same logical name here, registration name. So we are using the same bookstore web app, and we are also specifying the client secret. So remember when we configure, we said this is a secured confidential access type, right? So this is why we can configure our secrets without exposing it to public, right? That's why we created it as a confidential client. So here, if you go to credentials, you can take this value, copy it, and you can paste it here. Okay. Now authorization code grant type, there are a list of possible values, authorization code, client credentials, things like that. So ours is authorization code, and the scopes is OpenID and profile. And redirect URI, again what we configured in here, if you go to settings, redirect URL, we configured it to be localhost 8080/login OAuth2 code bookstore web app, right? So I am giving the same here. So we don't need to give actual localhost 8080 based on port we are giving. Instead, you can replace that with this placeholder, and our application Spring is going to take care of replacing this with actual host name and the port number this application is running. This, in the sense, bookstore web application. So the rest of the thing we have entered just the way we provided this URL. Okay, and this is where we are configuring provider. We can configure multiple providers, but in our case we are only configuring Keycloak server. But here you can specify provider.google and then provide Google configuration parameters, GitHub and GitHub parameters, and you will be able to choose which one you want to log in with. But here in our application we are only using Keycloak issuer. So this issuer is nothing but the realm URL. So this is the realm URL, localhost 9191/realms/bookstores. That is what. Usually we need to configure a few more things also, authorization URI, token URI, JWT, set URI, user info URI. So if we want to provide values, we can do that like this, we can configure. But if you go to our this realm URL, right, localhost 9191 realms/bookstore, if you go to here, if you click on this realm settings, and there is a endpoints section under which we have OpenID endpoint configuration. So if you click on this, if you take a look at localhost 9191 realms/bookstore, after that there is a well-known OpenID configuration. So this is a standard API endpoint available for all the OAuth supported servers, and our server is going to make a call to this and then try to figure out if you don't provide any of these configuration parameters, any of these authorization URI, token URI, JWT set URI, all this, it is going to make a call to this API endpoint, and here it can get all the details: authorization endpoint, token endpoint, user info endpoint. So whatever the missing details it needs, it can get from this API endpoint. So that is why we don't need to configure rest of these things. We just need to set issuer URI. Okay, that is enough. So with this, our application is secured, which means with simple these changes alone, if you try to start your application and try to access localhost 8080, it is going to redirect you to the login page. By default, when you add Spring Security, it is going to lock down all the URLs and secure all the API endpoints and URLs. But we don't want to lock down everything. We want to allow users to browse through the catalog and be able to see the products without having to log in first. So we are configuring that customization. So under Bookstore Web App, I have created a config package under which I have security configuration. So here I am adding this enable web security, and it's a Spring configuration class, and for now let us keep it this. We'll talk about it later. And we are going to customize our security filter chain. In Spring Security 6 onwards, this is the way you can customize the security configuration. Earlier, you might have seen extending some Spring Security adapter or something like that. But now you need to register this security filter chain bean, and you can customize various aspects of it. So here what we are doing, we are authorize HTTP request and then customizing all these URL patterns like any JS files, any CSS images, and any error page request, WebJar request, or actuator endpoints, and mainly /products and /API products endpoint. They are supposed to be available public. They don't need authentication. So we listed all these public URLs and then specifying permit all. You don't need security in order to access these API URL patterns, and then any other request should be authenticated. Okay, and that is it. And for now we are simply disabling CARs and CSRF. Again, these are very important things to keep in mind. Simply disabling is not a good thing for production, but again these things are itself some complex topics that takes a lot of time to describe. As I mentioned, OAuth2 or even security it itself is a big concept if you want to go in depth. But right now I am going to simply disable this, but this is not a good pattern for production grade. Maybe in some other series we may talk about CARs and CSRF in depth. Okay, so next, OAuth2 login. We are just going with the defaults, and then logout. Here we are customizing how logout should happen. So here what we are doing, we are saying clear the authentication. So once the user is authenticated, the security context is stored with the authentication information, and it might use HTTP session. So here we are cleaning all that state, login state, and also we are customizing how to handle the logout success handler. So when you click on the logout URL, it is going to clear all this HTTP session and authentication, and also handle what to do next. So here we are customizing how to handle this. Here again we are implementing a customized login success logout success handler, and we are saying to redirect to the base URL. Again, do you remember we have the same base URL used in here also, which is going to take the current URL base URL like HTTP localhost 8080, right? So it is going to take that. Where it should match? It should match what we have configured in our Keycloak. Here, if you go to clients and Bookstore Web App, we specified valid post logout redirect URIs. So here we mentioned HTTP localhost 8080, and this is what it is going to represent. This is where many people do a small mistake and then struggle. If we simply put a slash here, and then if you don't include the slash here, it is going to say invalid redirect URI, and then it causes a lot of problems. So make sure that what you are entered here is exactly same what you are providing here. Okay, so with this configuration we are good to go. And what additional changes we have done, if we go to our templates, especially layout template, here we have included this security related tag handler here. Okay, so here we can use, earlier we have simply displayed orders link directly. Even without users logging in, they should be able to see the orders link and then click on it. Now we use this security : authorize and specify is authenticated. So only users who already logged in can only see this one. I mean, this tag is not going to be rendered if the current user is not already logged in. Okay, so similarly I have created a couple of links. One is for security : authorize not is authenticated. If it is not authenticated, we are showing this login link, and again it is going into OAuth2 authorization bookstore. This is the login link for our provider. So here we have configured this, right? Bookstore web app. So we are giving that, and then logout is at the default URL is /logout, and we are going to show this only if user is authenticated. So these are the customizations we have done. Okay, so with this, now let us go ahead and let me check once again. Here we have all the backend infra services running fine. Now I am going to first start catalog service. Then I am going to start API gateway, and maybe start order service as well. Okay, so all these three are running. Now I am going to start web application as well. So once all the 4 services are up and running, we can go ahead and check localhost 8080. Now we are able to see the products and everything, and I can even add products to the cart. And here if you see, as I have not yet logged in, it is showing the login page, but I have not protected this cart page. If you see our security configuration, I have not protected cart page. That means I should log in order to see the cart page. So now here if I click on cart, it is redirecting me to the Keycloak's login page. Here I need to use my user credentials, Siva1234, and I am logging in. Okay, so now I am able to navigate. Now after I log in, I can see the orders link as well. Earlier I was not able to see, and also login link is gone, and now it is showing logout. So now if I go to cart and I place an order, it is creating successfully. Now I can see the orders as well, and I can see the details as well. So everything is fine. Now if I take cart link and then I log out, and even if I try to directly go to cart page, it is going to redirect to login page. And again this time let me log in with Prasad, the second user, Prasad1234, and cart is empty. Now I can continue shopping, add a couple of products, and go to cart and place order here. Okay, now if I go to orders, now I am seeing 2. The first one, I think this is placed by user Siva, but this is placed by Prasad user. But still I have not implemented the logic to actually take who is the current logged in user and use that to create the order, right? So currently we are still seeing all the orders placed by all the users. So, but we have protected our web application with the login successfully. Okay. So this is a good start. Next, we are going to see how we can get the current login username, and then we can use that while placing the order and pass that order information. Pass that current logged in user information. From the bookstore web app point of view, the next thing we need to tackle is, while creating the orders, we need to take the current user's access token and then send it as a authorization header to our downstream services like order service. Okay, so how do we get the current logged in user's access token? So here inside services package, I have created a class called security helper, and here what I'm doing, so when we add OAuth to security, it is automatically auto configure this OAuth2 authorized client service. So we are injecting that, and we have a method called get access token. So in that, what we are doing, so if you are familiar with Spring Security, we have this security context holder .get context and get authentication. So usually if you are implementing a simple JWT based authentication or even a plain server rendered typical web application security, you might know this is a kind of a represents username and password authentication token. But here we are using OAuth based security, right? So this, once we successfully authenticate with the OAuth2 provider, the implementation of this object is not username and password authentication token. Instead, it is OAuth2 authentication token. So when first we get the authentication, and then we are checking is it an instance of OAuth2 authentication token, and we are giving a alias name here. And if it is not true, we are simply returning null. But if it is a OAuth2 based authentication token, what we are doing, we are loading the current authenticated client information from authorized client service and specify, so current OAuth2 token, who is the registration ID, and this is nothing but bookstore web app, and we are giving the OAuth2 token name. So based on these two, it is going to return the current authorized client information. So here it contains all the information like access token, ID token, and all other details. So here we are first taking access token and get token value. So this is how you can obtain the current logged in user's access token. Okay, so we have this method here which is going to return the current logged in user's access token. Now how we are going to use this? So earlier we have created these clients, and under orders package we have this order service client. Earlier we have not specified any of the headers. Earlier we have simply create order and then take create order request object as the request body. Now for all the API endpoints for order service client, we have added this request header annotation and pass a map of string comma anything as the headers. So you can pass one or more headers to this API endpoints, and they are going to be sent as the headers because we have added this at request header. Okay, so this is going to be request body, and whatever the map that you are passing will be passed down as a header. Okay, we have added these headers for all the methods in this order service client. Fine, but how are we passing those? So here I have injected this in the order controller. I have injected this security helper, and then let's take the scenario of create order. So here, while creating this order, first I am getting the token value from this security helper, and I am creating the headers map of authorization is the name, header name, and we are using this bearer JWT token, so we need to prefix it with bearer space and then add the token and then pass those headers for each method. So this is what we are doing whenever we are calling any method on this order service client. So here also same thing, we are getting the headers and then we are passing them. So we are doing the same thing. So what happens from our bookstore web app point of view, we are we are authenticating the user and we are getting the current user's token, access token, and for calling any secured downstream service endpoints, we are passing this header, authorization header. Now it is the responsibility of the order service to also have the security configured and then validate the incoming authorization header and everything. From the bookstore web app point of view, we have done all the changes that are required. Okay. Now let us go ahead and see what we need to do to secure our order service using OAuth2 security. Now let us go ahead and see how we can secure our order service using OAuth2 security. So first let us start with our pom.xml configuration. So here I have added this security starter and OAuth2 resource server starter, because our order service is a resource server and we are going to protect this using JWT token based authentication. So we have added OAuth2 resource server starter here and also security. Okay, so having these two dependencies added, and we also want to customize the default security. As I already mentioned, when you simply add security, it is going to lock down all the API endpoints, but we want to customize some of the API endpoints to be allowed, some of them to be permitted. So here again, in the similar way, we are configuring all the actuator endpoints are allowed. Here we are calling permit all, and also the Swagger documentation, Open API documentation URLs are also configured to permit by everyone. So in order to call any of these API endpoints, you don't need to be authenticated, and any other request should be authenticated. That means you can only call any of the order related create order or get order details. So those API endpoints can be invoked only by authenticated users only. And then we are configuring, because this is going to be a stateless REST API, we are configuring this session policy as stateless. And again, we are disabling this CORS and CSRF, not a good thing. But as I said, we may discuss this in more detail in some other video. And finally, we are configuring, this is a OAuth2 resource server, and then we are enabling the JWT token based authentication with the default customizations. Okay, so this is the security configuration we have. But again, next, the thing that is remained is when somebody is calling these API endpoints, we have implemented API endpoints to get the current logged in user information and then use that while creating the order details. So we have that class in security service, right? So earlier in this get login username, we used to simply return a static variable user, a static string user. But now we are going to update this with the actual logic of who is the actual logged in user. So here the Spring Security and OAuth security is going to take care of performing all the authentication. And if how do we verify the authentication? It is going to check the authorization header and take that bearer token, and also going to verify with the authorization server whether this is a valid token or not. And then if it is a valid token, it is going to let the controller flow goes through the controller. Otherwise, it is going to reject with 401. So assuming you have provided a valid authorization header, and then it come down to this logic. And here earlier again we have talked about security context, get authentication. Normally it is going to return username and password token authentication or something. But in the web application, we have seen that is going to be OAuth2 user token or something. But here it is a resource server, and this is going to be of type JWT authentication token. So we have cast that into this, and then we are taking the current principal is nothing but the JWT. And from the JWT, we can extract many details like what are the preferred username, email, and what is the name, and even you can get the current access token value and what are the authorities are there. So all this information you can fetch from this JWT. but we are simply using the preferred username, and we are going to use that name to store all the wherever we are calling this get login username while creating a new order or while fetching the order details. Everywhere we are going to use that current logged in username. Okay, so these are all the changes that are required for order service also. So now with this okay, so we have forgot the key configuration in our application properties. So we have configured all that, but how does order service know that it needs to validate the authentication bearer token that is getting as the header to validate against, right? So this is where we configured OAuth2 configuration. Again, we take some variables to predefine what is the root URL of the OAuth server, Keycloak server, and what is the realm URL. And here we simply need to specify who is the JWT issuer URL. So this is nothing but the realm URL. So here you don't need to again register who is the client and all these details, because it is a resource server and all it has to do is take the incoming authorization token and then check with the issuer, whoever is issuing the token. It just need to verify with that one. It is not going to create a new token, right? So it doesn't need all other configuration parameters. Here you just need to configure the issuer information. This is sufficient. Okay, so with this configuration, now we are good to start. Let us restart. What are the applications we need to restart? First, let us restart the order service, and then let us restart our bookstore web application as well. Okay, so these are the two things I think we need to restart. Now let us go ahead and let's log out first, and then now let me add a couple of products. Now I want to log in here. So I will log in with Prasad 1 2 3 4, and I am placing the order. Okay, one order is created. Now if I click on orders, I am going to see only one order, because earlier also we have created a few orders, but they were stored. Let us go ahead and see if we have this database. Okay, not there. Let us connect to PostgreSQL orders DB. So here orders DB, and it is going to be 25432, and it is Postgres. So I am trying to connect to the orders PostgreSQL database here, and I have connected. Now if I go to orders, here I can see earlier without applying this security we have created a couple of orders. So for them username is stored as user. Now we have logged in with the user credentials of Prasad, and we can see this order is placed by username Prasad. So that's why when we see orders, when we try to see the orders, it is going to get all the orders where username equals to Prasad. Now let's log out and log in again using Siva this time. Siva user, Siva1234, and I can place an order. Okay, now if I go to check in the database, let me refresh. So a new order is placed. This time username is Siva. So this is how we are able to store who placed the order by taking the current login username from this security service. Here we get the current authentication token from the context, and then we extract the JWT, and from JWT we extracted preferred username, something like that. Maybe if you want to store email, you can store that. So basically you can extract various pieces of information from this JWT and use it, whatever is unique. Okay, so this is how we can secure our application. But now that our application is secure and we are able to place orders only after we log in, and then when we log in we can only see the orders that we placed. We cannot see somebody else's orders. Okay, so we are secured, we are securing this web store, fine. But now with this security applied, many other things might have got broken. For example, our tests. So our tests were written assuming there is no authentication in place. So now if we try to run this test, it is going to fail. Okay, so here you can see it is going to throw 401 or something like that. So all the things are failed. Here you can see it is giving 401 error, right? So now we need to fix tests, and also we need to fix our Swagger documentation, right? If you go to localhost 8989, which is our API gateway, and now catalog is working fine. But if you try to see here, and here if you try to place an order, you can't, right? Because you need to pass the authentication token. Without that it is going to fail anyway. Okay, so we need to configure some way to enable login inside this Swagger documentation and still be able to use this API endpoints. So that's what we are going to look at next. The integration tests are failing because our order service APIs are expecting valid JWT token as authorization header. But right now we do not have a provision to create a valid authorization header with a valid JWT token. So how do we solve this problem? So there are two different approaches, where which one is better or which one you want to go with depends on which trade-offs you want to make. Okay, so one approach would be to be able to spin up a Keycloak in a Docker container and configure it in an automated way and hit a API endpoint and get the token, valid token, and use that to make the order service API call. That is one approach. Another approach is there is a Spring Security test support where you can customize it to generate mock OAuth2 token and use that while making the API call using MockMvc. These are two different approaches. Let us start with the KeycloakContainer approach. So here there is a project called testcontainers Keycloak. We have already been using test containers for tests and running application locally. So we can use Keycloak test container to spin up a Keycloak container. We already exported one Keycloak realm file. We can use that, and then we can spin up this instance and make an API call and get the token. But for our actual application, we have enabled only standard flow. Right, while creating this bookstore web app client, we have enabled only standard flow. But in order to make a call and get the token, instead of going through the standard authorization code flow, I have enabled this direct access grant, which is nothing but a resource owner password credentials grant. And I have enabled that and then saved it. And using the same steps we have done, I have followed the same steps and created test realm file. With this enabled, with direct access grants enabled, and I took that realm file and under src test resources, I have copied this test bookstore realm JSON file. Now what I am doing here in our containers configuration file, I have put some constants here like what is the Keycloak image and what is the realm file path and what is the realm name. And here I have created a container bean. Because Springboot out of the box supports service connection support for Postgres and RabbitMq, we can directly add this at service connection. But it doesn't have out of the box service connection support for Keycloak container. When you want to use any container which doesn't have out of the box service connection support, still you can use any of the container like this. You create a method which returns a container and mark it as a bean, and provide this dynamic property registry as a argument to this method. And you can start the Keycloak container, and then you can register the properties whichever you want to provide, and return the container. So it is going to start this container and register these properties, customized properties. So what we are doing here, we are creating a container using this image, and we are also specifying to import this realm file, and we are adding this Spring Security OAuth resource server issuer URI to this one. We are dynamically getting the authorization server URL realms/bookstore what we have configured. So we are dynamically changing this path which we have configured in our application properties file. So here we have configured this one, right? So we need to change dynamically to the container URL that we are starting with this one. So that's what we are doing here. So now that when we run our integration test, this is going to start this container, and this property is configured to this dynamic container. Then how are we going to get a valid token? Now let us go to this abstract IT, which is the base class for all the integration tests, right? So here I have configured a few standard properties that we have used in our bookstore web app client registration. I have client ID, client secret, and username and password. Okay, so and then I have this OAuth2 resource server properties auto-wide in this. Now at the end I have added a method called get token. So here what I am doing, I am using REST template, and then I am submitting a form, and I have put all these properties in a map, multi-value map. So what is the grant type I am using? I am using password grant type. That is why I have enabled this direct access grants, which is nothing but resource owner password credentials grant. Okay, so I am using that grant type, and I specify client ID, client secret, and username and password. Okay, and finally I am getting the token URL. To get the token, this is the URL I need to post the request to, and I am using header with all these headers and map. Finally making a call to using REST template to this authorization server URL by passing this request, and I am expecting the response to be in this Keycloak token format. That is nothing but a simple record here which contains access token. Okay, so it is going to make a request to the Keycloak container, and then return this Keycloak token as a response which contains the access token. Okay, so this way I am making a request to the Keycloak container and getting the token, valid token. So I have this as a protected method. Now if I go to order controller test, before making any requests, so here I am adding a header with authorization as the header name, and adding this bearer space as a prefix, and then calling this get token. So for every API call that I am making, I am including this header like this, so that before making any API call, it is going to get a token and then include that as a authorization header. Okay, so that is how I am able to make the calls. So now if I run this, it is going to run fine, because it is able to get a valid token and then pass it as authorization header. So the tests are working fine. Then what is the problem with this approach? The problem with this approach is, in the production we are using standard flow, but for testing we are using this password credentials grant. It is a shortcut that we are taking to get the valid token, but we are assuming that it is going to work fine. But the benefit is we are actually making a call to Keycloak server, and we are validating our configuration if there is any security configuration and everything. It is making all that into consideration, and then we are making the calls. But only thing is, instead of standard flow, we are using password grant and then getting the token. That is the downside. And what is the alternative? So the alternative is, before that let me show you the POM configuration here. I have added this Spring Security test because we are adding this OAuth support, right? So I have added this one. For Keycloak support, I have added this test containers Keycloak dependency. Okay, so I got the details from this. Okay, so you can use this container like this. So the other alternative is, you might have seen using with mock test or something like that. Let's say if you are running any tests, you might have seen using it with MockUser, something like that, right? So what it will do, it will create a security context authentication object based on some mock values. But this works fine if you are using typical username and password based authentication. But we are not using username and password based authentication. Instead, we are using OAuth based authentication, right? So this is not going to work. So for that, what we have done, I have created a annotation called with mock OAuth2User, and I provide some customization properties here using a default role and default username and value like that. And here I have mentioned with security context factory equals to this class. So mock OAuth2 user context factory. So this is the class I have created here, which implements this with security context factory, and this is the annotation that we have created. So in order to implement this, we need to implement this create security context, and with the same annotation as the input here. And here we are extracting various data from this annotation attributes, like we are extracting username, and if it is not there, we are throwing exception. We are also taking the authorities from the annotation roles, and then we are adding them as authorities. And also we are preparing some predefined claims like preferred username equals to the configured username, and we are adding some static user ID and realm access as authorities. So things like that. And then finally we are creating a JWT object with some mock token value, and then created time, like issued time, something like that, expired time, all this, and headers and claims. So basically we are all preparing a JWT authentication token, mock token value, and then setting that inside this security context folder. That's what we are doing in this. So once we have created this annotation and this security context factory, how we can do? So instead of using rest assured, here I have created another class get order test, which is still extending abstract ID. But I made some changes to this abstract ID where I enabled this MockMvc auto configuration by adding this annotation here, and also I have auto-wired this MockMvc. Okay, so once I did this, I have created a test by adding with mock OAuth2User and giving any username here, and I am making a call to this get all the orders. Okay, so here if I run this, it is going to put the OAuth user, mock user that we are creating in the factory into the security context, and then proceeding to this API endpoint. Okay. Okay, so the test is successful. But for this, we don't need to run the Keycloak container and all that, get token method and all that. But we are simply using MockMvc instead of making a real API call using rest assured. But why we can go with this approach? The reason being, actually for testing that order placing and all after logging in, this looks more like a end-to-end test, which you can automate using Cypress or Selenium, something like that. So if you want to delegate this instead of mocking or something like that, maybe you can go ahead and use end-to-end test for this, for testing these flows, and only use MockMvc to mock the OAuth and then test API level logic. Okay, so these are two different approaches. where you can use MockMvc and then set this context, security context, with a MockOauth token, or you can spin up KeycloakContainer by enabling that password token, password grant, and then making an API call to get the token and use the token. So these are the two approaches. I'm going to leave the code with the two approaches. Whichever you want to go with, you can go with that approach. In addition to this integration test, there is also one unit test that we have written here, and this is a WebMVC slice test. And what earlier we have not added this with MockUser. Now we need to add this with MockUser, and also we need to add this dot with CSRF, because we are making a post request. We want to get through the CSRF process, so we can add this with CSRF to enable CSRF support with MockMvc, and we are setting a MockUser in the context. So now we can run this unit test as well. Okay, so it's working fine. So these are two ways you can unit test and integration test your APIs that are secured with OAuth2. Things seems to be working fine, but there is a surprise, like if you are trying to run all the services within the Docker containers, then there will be some issues. So let's see what happens if you run all the services in the Docker containers itself. Earlier we have run infrastructure only in the Docker containers, and all the services, microservices, we have started from our IDE on the host machine itself. So now I am going to configure based on this OAuth security implementation. We need to add some properties, like in the order service we need to add OAuth2 server URL. So I am giving it, so here in the OAuth server we need to configure this value. Right now in the local we have configured it to localhost 9191, but when you are running inside Docker containers, this should be the host name of the Keycloak, which is host Keycloak. So we are configuring this way, and similarly we need to add that property for our web application as well. So here we also add this here. So with this configuration, I have started all the services in the Docker containers. Now if I go to localhost 8080, and this is working fine here, now I'm able to see the products, but let's say I want to go to login page. So now it is going to redirect to Keycloak 9191, but my host doesn't know what is the host Keycloak means, right? Because we have configured that Keycloak 9191 as the authorization server, and it is going to redirect to this Keycloak. And we can think, what if we can just give the name localhost? But localhost again means from our host it is going to resolve properly, because we have mapped the 9191 to Keycloak server. But again the hosts are different, and it is going to fail in the down the line. So one thing what we can do, we can configure our host file. Like here if you go to cat etc hosts, earlier we have configured catalog service, right? Similarly we can configure Keycloak also, mapping to the local host. So let us do that. So here I am going to map Keycloak host name to the localhost 127.0.0.1. Okay, so with this, now let us go back to our application, and here let us try to log in. Now it is going to Keycloak server. Okay, so this is working fine. And similarly you may also have to map the other services when we are trying to use Swagger documentation, like we have seen already. Okay, so this is how you can configure. Now what is remaining is we need to adjust the Swagger documentation to be able to authenticate ourselves, and then we should be able to call order service API endpoints. So let us take a look at how we can do that. So far, our Swagger API documentation is generated with the default settings. We have not customized anything. But for our orders Swagger documentation, now that we have implemented API security using OAuth2, we need to customize it so that users can authenticate themselves and then invoke the API endpoints. For that, we can provide a customized open API bin, and then we can provide the security requirements and then add the security schema as OAuth2. So users can be able to log in from the Swagger documentation itself. So what we are doing here, so we are injecting this issuer URI, which is already configured in our application properties. So here, this is the property we are trying to obtain. So this value is nothing but realm URL. Okay, so once we have that one, we are also configuring API gateway URL. Instead of directly invoking the order service, we are invoking through Swagger documentation. So here what we are doing, we are providing some basic information about our API, and then as a server, we are adding this API gateway URL instead of directly using order service itself. So we'll see where this is going to affect in the Swagger documentation. And the most important part is adding this security item, and we are adding it as a authorization requirement here. And the component is here we are adding the security schemes with the name security underscore auth. And here we are adding that this is of type OAuth2, and we are specifying which flows we want to use. And here we are saying we want to use authorization code grant type. And for that we are specifying where is the authorization URL, what is the token URL and all. And again, this is the base URI we already got. And this is the part we are appending, which is used as the authorization URL. Similarly, token URL also. And we are specifying scopes as OpenID and OpenID scope. So with this customization, and what is the API gateway URL we are configuring? So if we go to Swagger documentation, so this is what we are going to use as API gateway for order service, right? API gateway is running on 8989, and whatever it starts with orders is going to be forwarded to order service. So we are configuring this URL here, and we are using this key and bind this value to this variable and added these servers like this. Once we have added this OpenAPI bean configuration with this security scheme, we also need to specify on which controller API endpoints we need to enable this so that we can pass this token along with the request. So here in all the for all the methods that are defined in this controller, I want to include that. So I have added this add security requirement name equals to security auth. So that name is nothing but what is the key we configured here. So here for all the endpoints, I want to use this JWT token. That's why I mentioned at the class level. But if you want to only apply that for a specific endpoints, you can put that on the handler methods in itself instead of on the class level. Okay. So with this configuration, when I restart all the services, both infra services and our microservices in Docker, now I am seeing this documentation like this. Now if I go to orders, and now this is the button that is appearing with our customization. Now also if you take a look at our catalog, it is showing it as a generated URL like HTTP catalog service. So this is the default service name we have, that is why it is showing like this. And if you take a look at orders, we have explicitly added this API gateway URL, so that is why it is showing it like this. Now how I can authorize myself? Now if I click on it, I want to provide this client ID bookstore web app and client secret, which is already we have configured in our order service. In our bookstore service, bookstore web app, we have our client secret, right? So we want to use that and select this, authorize it. Now we are getting this invalid parameter. Why? If we take a look at this request here, it is mentioned redirect URI equals to http localhost 8989/webjars/swagger UI, like that. So basically, if we take a look at our web app configuration, we have configured valid redirect URI equals to only this one. If we try to pass any other URL, it is going to fail like this. So we are going to add this another URL that is requested here as additional valid redirect URL. Okay, so this is the one that is being requested through this URL, http localhost 8989/webjars/swagger/UI/OAuth2 redirect.html. That is the URL that is being requested here. So I am adding this and saving it. Okay, now with this, if I restart, now it is properly rendering this sign in form. Now I am going to use my credentials and login, but still it is going to throw this error. The reason being, if I open the DevTools, here you can see access to this Keycloak URL from localhost 8989 is blocked because of the CORS policy. So if you go to Keycloak again and if you check the web origins, so right now we only configured the request to Keycloak will be coming from only 8080 localhost 8080, but we are making calls from localhost 8989 as well. Okay, so that's why I am adding this 8989 also and saving it. Now if I go and try to close it, restart, refresh it and try to authenticate myself again using client ID and client secret, this time it is successful and it got the access code. Now if you go and try to check here, execute, here you can see it is making the request to through API gateway, and here you can also see it is already including this access token. So here if you notice, now we are getting this CORS error. Why? Because from our host, API gateway is not a valid host. So let us change that. So here I am going to add So here I am going to enable this 127.0.0.1 for API gateway hostname. Okay. Now let me refresh it once and authorize myself again. Okay. Now if I try this, so I got the empty response because it is authenticated successfully and I am passing this JWT token as a authorization header. I am getting the response, but there are no orders yet. Okay. So finally we have applied OAuth2 based security for our microservices based application. We have secured order service and bookstore web application, and also we have customized Swagger documentation so that users can authenticate themselves and then invoke the secured API endpoints. And we have also seen how to write integration tests and unit tests for secured API endpoints as well. So I hope you find this useful, and thanks for watching. Bye bye.